Welcome everybody to today's webinar on rooting your investment policy and guidelines in faith-based principles. I am Nana Francois, Director of Membership here at FaithInvest. Delighted to be joined by my colleague Matthew Jensen on the membership team. And we are also very excited and delighted to be joined by our chairman, Dave Zellner, CIO of WestPath, who will also share his words of wisdom today. So, faith-consistent investment policy and guidelines set out how your faith values and positions can inform your policy guidelines and ultimately investments. And they set a really strong foundation for faith-based organizations, not only to communicate internally what they care about, but also to externally communicate the strategies and opportunities that they want their service providers to align to as well. Now, FaithInvest exists to support faith-based organizations to invest in this faith-consistent manner. And we really see our role as starting this foundational work, sharing wisdom, building critical mass to support a faith-consistent approach, and then moving swiftly into working groups to support the implementation and to address any challenges. So we're really glad you've joined us today just to share thoughts and wisdom and questions on this foundational piece of work. And with that, I will hand you over to my colleague, Matthew Jensen, to start us off today.
Thank you, Nana. Hello, everybody. Very excited to be here today talking about this subject, which is really foundational for faith-based investors. It's the starting point for your investment program. And it's frankly not a new concept. It's originated a long time ago. In fact, most recently was reinforced in the Zook guidelines on faith-consistent investing. And I love some of the materials that came out of the Zook conference, including this quote here, an important reminder about the business of religions and the assets, the resources that religions control. And it's really this part of the religious experience, the business of religions, that involves managing these assets that we're focusing on today. The helpful thing for most religions, in fact, all religions, have some type of document that states what they value in terms of social issues, environmental issues, health issues, weapons, and other activities. These are typically very well documented over hundreds of years, in many cases, within the faith, what that faith values. Faiths also have investments. They have pools of assets that are there for a purpose, either to support paying retirement benefits, to report operational expenses of the faith, to support giving or grants, or an endowment or foundation that the faith may have. Those are typically pools of assets that the faith is managing to achieve some goal and some objective. And our focus through this effort and an introduction to this today is really making sure you have a very strong bridge between the values of the faiths and how the assets of the faiths are managed. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're thrilled to have Dave here representing WestPath, one of the organizations that has done an excellent job at integrating their faith values with their investment programs. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Dave to talk about how they did that, what they care about, and how they went about it. Dave?
Hi, Matthew. Thanks very much. And I wanted to give a little background on WestPath, which we're an independent agency, and we're authorized by the United Methodist Church to administer benefit programs on behalf of 100,000 active and retired United Methodist clergy and lay employees and their beneficiaries. And the value of our investment supporting these programs is about $28 billion US. Our faith's governing body, it meets every 4 years, and it's the ultimate authority over our work. And its directive to us has remained consistent over the years. Our agency must manage assets prudently in the sole interest of our stakeholders. And so what this means is that we're not obligated to invest in alignment with our faith values, but rather the United Methodist governing body asks that we make a conscious effort to align our investments with the faith values. However, our agency does devote meaningful resources to understand and apply our faith's values where we believe that doing so aligns with our fiduciary obligation to our stakeholders. More specifically, our board of directors has designated a committee independent of its investment committee that monitors the work of our agency to ensure that we are making a sincere effort to understand and apply church values in administering our investment program. Now, consistent with our fiduciary obligations to our shareholders and stakeholders, we have formalized a set of 10 investment beliefs that have been approved by our board of directors. An important critical belief, which is very much influenced by our study and understanding of United Methodist values, is the concept of sustainability. We specifically state that our approach to sustainable investing honors the value, mission, and tradition of the United Methodist Church. This belief has led to what we call our sustainable economy vision. And we believe that attaining the investment returns that are required to fulfill our fiduciary obligation to our stakeholders requires achieving and maintaining a sustainable economy. Now, we define a sustainable economy as one that is grounded in social cohesion, prosperity for all, and environmental health. Hence, our investments and other activities supporting our investments must eventually lead to outcomes aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, we began this journey of investing for outcomes leading to a sustainable economy many years ago. We recognize the urgency of achieving positive societal outcomes, but we accept that we must act carefully, deliberately, and pragmatically. We accept that the investment landscape has not yet evolved to a point where we can invest all our assets for outcomes aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and continue to fulfill our fiduciary obligations. However, we have taken a number of positive steps to invest for outcomes. Over the past 30 years, we've deployed over $2 billion in capital to fund market rate loans for affordable housing and community development projects in underserved communities. We have modified our passive index tracking portfolios to overweight companies preparing for a transition to a low carbon economy and underweight companies that are not prepared for the transition. We inform and monitor our external asset managers by ensuring that they are evaluating environmental, social, and governance factors in the selection of securities and the managing of their portfolios. And we actively engage companies and public policymakers through myriad investor coalitions with a goal of abandoning unsustainable, near-term, profit-maximizing business practices. And in lieu of that, we encourage companies to adopt business policies and for public policymakers to enact public policy that align with our sustainable economy vision. In conclusion, WestPath absolutely believes that aligning our investments with our values will lead to positive change in the real economy. Changes that will ultimately help us ensure the security of our participants and help the United Methodist Church achieve its mission. So those are my comments, and I'll turn it back to you, Matthew.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dave. And WestPath is a great example among many faiths who are very good examples of the systematic and pragmatic integration of the faith values throughout the entire plan. And it is a process, and it does require some time commitment and resource commitment to making this happen. And one of the very important first entry points for integrating faith values into your plan are through the documents you already have that oversee the management of your assets. everybody should have an investment policy that essentially sets out the governing goals, objectives, the definitions, the reporting, the measures of success, what is success for this plan, for that investment plan. Whether you're a faith or a non-faith, you have an investment policy for that plan. In addition to the investment policy, you also have investment guidelines. The investment guidelines sit within the investment policy and really turn that investment policy into investment language that can be applied to the investments, to asset classes, to the managers you've hired, to the portfolios that you've set up, to the investments that you make. They are conjoined documents. One supports the other. Both of these documents, as I mentioned, exist for all investment plans. The challenge for faiths is integrating the values of the faith into the investments that the faith is making. And the main entry point for doing this is through these important governing documents for the faith plan. The reason you do this is because by aligning the assets of the faith intentionally with what the faith wants to achieve, helps the faith achieve those goals and those values throughout the retirement plan. And the entry point for this, for the retirement plan, is through these two key documents. This type of integration roots all your investment decisions. It provides the context for making decisions within the portfolio that are aligned with the faith values. This relationship is important because, as I mentioned earlier, faiths have done a wonderful job at documenting what they value. If those values aren't integrated with and defined within the investment policy, and therefore aren't integrated with the investment guidelines, you can end up with a portfolio of investments that's a mix of things. In fact, we've seen some faiths will carve out a portion of their assets and designate that portion to be aligned with the values of the faiths, while the rest of the assets are not, or are aligned with another benchmark or another objective. And you end up with a collection of different things in the portfolio. But by incorporating the values of the faith within the investment policy, taking those values and turning those into investment language, you hopefully end up with a portfolio that is fully aligned, that every investment has a purpose, and that purpose is aligned to the extent possible with the values of the faith. This is an important nesting process, and it's a process you walk through. I realize most of faiths have these documents in existence today, and what we're encouraging through this process is, as Dave mentioned, revisiting those documents, encouraging you to look at the faith values, translate those into policy and then to guidelines, and have those help direct and inform the investments that the faith is making within that plan. The rest of this presentation, we're going to talk about a very high level how to do that. But first, I want to have a quick comment on performance and risk, because we often get asked the question of, look, if I incorporate the values of my faith into my investments, what are the implications for performance or risk of those retirement assets? And I will say this is a very common observation that we hear. Many faith-based investors strongly believe that investing consistent with faith values leads to either better performance, better risk, or lower costs. All three of those, one of those, two of those. But what we hear from the faiths is this alignment actually supports improved results. This is a very important discussion for you to have with your faith leaders, with your board and your governance overseeing the plan, and make sure you're clear on this position and you've documented in the investment policy. I will say, from a research or quantitative perspective, there's certainly been a lot of research done on this question. In fact, there was a fantastic research paper out earlier this month from NYU, which was a meta study of over 1,000 ESG studies on the impact of ESG on financial and investment performance, which is very supportive to the positive impact of ESG on those factors, on financial and investment performance. Research like that, which we can share, and other research out there, should provide some of the quantitative or research underpinning that supports this kind of discussion, and then documentation that you need to have as a leadership team for the assets that the faith is managing. And make sure you capture and document that policy position within the investment policy. Very important to do. Outside of performance and risk, you can see, as we go back to the two key documents, the investment policy and the investment guidelines, there's a number of other areas where the faith values have a role to play, in the definitions, in the reporting that you're doing, in the assessment of success. What is success for this plan? And then the investment guideline level, it can impact, as Dave gave an example earlier, the benchmark you select, the exposures that you allow or encourage or don't allow, and other portfolio parameters that are part of those, part of your investment structure. It flows through both of these documents. So let's start to get specific. As I mentioned earlier, the faiths have documented their values very thoroughly. A careful reading of these documents, or a careful revisit of these documents, very often can lead to a whole list of negative actions to avoid or reduce, or positive actions to promote or pursue. Careful reading of those documents leads to these list of items. We call these items faith positions. And these faith positions are essentially a translation of the values into things you should do and things you shouldn't do in an investment context. And we find that these faith positions usually fall into three categories that you'll recognize. The first is screening. Screening, this first item under screening, is extremely common. Probably all of you have documents as part of your policy and guidelines where you've expressed either a sector or an industry, or even some faiths have lists of companies that are excluded. They're not allowed to be held in the portfolio because the activities of those companies go directly against the value of the faith as expressed in a faith position. Very common approach today as part of investment guidelines. An area where we're seeing more development today, and is less common in plans now, but increasingly common, is saying, okay, we know what we don't want to own. What should we own? What should we emphasize in the portfolio? And I'll give you an example of this type of language a little bit later in the presentation. So that's screening. The other area is engagement. And again, the first one under engagement is something probably all of you have, is your proxy voting policy. And your proxy voting policy should be aligned with the values of your faith. When a proxy comes in the door from a company, you check it against your proxy voting guidelines. Those guidelines represent the values of the faith, and you vote appropriately on that proxy voting policy. Very common in policies and guidelines that we review today. What we're increasingly seeing in the faith community, spreading throughout the faith community, is the more active side of engagement. And this involves primarily two things. One is getting proxies for companies as part of the company proxy voting. So actively promoting a proxy issue that aligns with the value of the faith. You can do this as groups, you can do this individually. There's organizations like ICCR and others that are very good at encouraging faiths and leading faiths through the process. It can be a very complicated process of getting a proxy onto a company's proxy voting ballot. The other area here under engagement is actually directly engaging management on an issue or value of importance to the faith. And again, we see these done individually, particularly for larger faith investors. We see it done in groups, either self-organized groups or through advocacy organizations, where they're going directly to company managements and advocating for values, changes in that company that align with the values of that faith. So a much more active approach to company engagement. The third area that we see for faith positions is around impact. And this is where the faith is saying, along with a financial or risk objective we have for these assets based on what we've documented in our policy, we also have a purposeful and direct environmental or social outcome that we want to see alongside of those return and risk objectives for this investment. These types of investments tend to be very targeted and very specific to a value that the faith has and has documented in the faith position and in the investment policy of the plan. And today they tend to take the form of either a CDFI or private equity or private debt investment, either in a fund. We've seen some direct activity, or a fund to fund, where the faith has said, this particular investment is something we want to pursue because of the outcome, the values aligned outcome of that investment. And that really falls into an impact category where you're actively pursuing a values-based outcome. One other way to think about this page is from maybe simple to complex. And so some of the easier things for faiths to do, they've done. The exposures to avoid, the proxy voting policy that aligns with the faith values. Some of the more difficult or complex things to do involve being proactive around faith values and doing things like proposing proxies, engaging management, pursuing impact investments. Those are more active and can be more complex activities for a faith. But helpfully, as you go through this process, you've now defined the context for that. And there's plenty of organizations, including ours and others, who can help on these other issues where the complexity does go up a little bit, but where you can do things that align your investment with your faith values. Now, how does this appear in practice? And I'll give you an example on screening. And Nana and I have read many investment policies and guidelines for faiths. There's a lot out there available. And of course, we engage with a lot of faiths and read these types of documents. And I wanted to give you an example of the things we see today in some of the policies and guidelines that we see. And this is under the area, the faith position example of screening. This first type of screen is very common, essentially excluding an industry that is involved in an activity that goes against a stated value of the faith as captured in the faith documents. In this case, this particular faith investor used a GICS or a GICS industry definition, very standard, very well known, very easy for your asset managers to implement, very easy for you to monitor, very common approach. We've seen some faith investors get a little more nuanced about this, where they seek to define the core of a business. And in this case, this particular faith said, anything where the revenues from an activity are greater than 10% of the total revenues for that company, we consider that to be a core activity. And if that core activity is in either of these areas, coal or oil sands production, you're not allowed to hold that company. A little more nuanced approach to this type of restriction, it allows them to hold companies where maybe they're doing something that doesn't align with the faith values in a very small part of their conglomerate portfolio, but the faith gets to benefit from the other activities that this company is doing. A little more complex, a little more difficult to monitor, but the data is there. Your investment managers should be able to provide reporting and do the screening based on this criteria. And the third area that we see, and this is a little more advanced, it says, okay, we've told you what not to own in the portfolio. Here's what we want you to emphasize. And in this case, Faith Investor said, we want you to invest in companies that contribute to solving the climate issue in a constructive manner. And later in their guidelines, they actually define, what does this mean? What does contribute solving in a constructive manner mean? in investment language that an investment manager can take and act on, and that faith can then monitor. But this is essentially an example of positive screening for that portfolio. At this point, we've done a lot of work. So we've gone through the documented faith values. We've turned those into faith positions in one of those or all of those three categories. And now we have some work to do to take that analysis that we've done and incorporate it into the investment policy. So then the investment policy, we now have definitions for screening that we're going to integrate. And hopefully those definitions from our faith positions align with the faith values. We have definitions for engagement, our proxy voting policy, our proxy promotion policy, and our management engagement policy on what issues and when. And then the third area we're going to document is impact, our impact activities we're going to seek in the portfolio. What type of values are we going to pursue with our impact activities? How much of the portfolio are we prepared to commit to impact activities? And how are we going to govern and oversee that aspect of the portfolio? We've now captured that information in the investment policy, and now we need to turn to the investment guidelines and start turning some of those policies into investment instructions. And as we saw earlier, we'll have things like explicit exclusions. We may have minimum aligned criteria, so the definition of a core business for a company, as an example. And we may have criteria for asset managers that we use in the portfolio. And we'll, of course, have reporting criteria to make sure that whatever guidelines we've set up, we can monitor. The helpful thing on the reporting side is there's been a lot of development in reporting on essentially faith values over the last 5 to 10 years, with efforts like SASB and others providing reporting frameworks and data that faiths can use to monitor their investment in line with their values. The other thing I'll say on this page, and Dave talked about this in his presentation, is you need to be practical and pragmatic. And that's why we have, for example, the item here, applicable asset classes. So we hear from some faith investors that, for example, finding an ESG-oriented investment manager or investment strategy in emerging markets equity is very difficult today. There isn't a lot of choice. There isn't a lot of availability. There isn't a lot of data in emerging markets on ESG criteria. So you as a governing body may decide that, look, we appreciate the benefits of emerging markets enough. We appreciate the impact our capital investment is having emerging markets enough that for the time being, we're going to exclude that asset class from, say, our ESG criteria that we've defined in the portfolio. And you would remove emerging markets from the applicable asset classes as defined in your investment guidelines. But an important step here would be to document that in the investment policy and make sure you're doing two things. As part of the governance process of the plan, you're regularly revisiting availability of ESG strategies in emerging markets. And two, that you're actively promoting your demand for ESG strategies in emerging markets with the asset management community, so that hopefully down the road, you can incorporate a strategy there and add emerging market equities as an example to the applicable asset classes for your policy and guidelines. Just a note on being pragmatic. And that's something that we, your peers and other organizations can help you with as well. And certainly, as given our links and bridges to the asset management community, we would love to hear areas where asset managers can step up and deliver strategies and that faiths need so that they don't have to exclude asset classes from their investment policies and guidelines. Dave already did a great example of how the Methodist Church applies this. And as you heard from his discussion, they're extremely systematic and thoughtful in their examination of the Book of Discipline, which captures the values of the Methodist faiths, in translating those into faith positions that they then document in their policy statement, and then in some very detailed ways, translating those into investment instructions that can be translated by asset managers into investments for their portfolios in their investment guidelines. There's a number of wonderful examples within their investment policy and investment guidelines where they clearly reference back to their founding faith values, the Book of Discipline, on how the value of the faith has influenced both of these documents. A successful effort in this area, in audit, I would say, assuming you already have these documents, is that you should be able to draw that line across from the values document to the policy statement, to the guidelines, and then ultimately to all the investments that you're making within your plan.
Thank you, Matthew, for walking us through in detail exactly how you build up the building blocks from values and positions to policy and guidelines and investments, and how you work through the process from your screening to your engagement all the way through to impact. As we said at the start, and as Dave emphasized, we really see this work as foundational. And this has been an introduction to the topic. We really want to encourage you to think about next steps from here and to guide you in two particular directions, thinking about next steps in terms of your investment strategy and next steps in terms of your advocacy strategy. Because as faith-based organizations, we feel and we see and we hear that there is a responsibility to do both to align your own investments to be faith consistent, but also to work with others and to advocate for this kind of approach, which fundamentally changes the ways in which you choose to invest. So from an investment strategy perspective, what do we see as the right next steps? The first, and it's one that Matthew really emphasized, is to look at your faith values and kind of say, what is your position? What is your position in terms of what matters, in terms of how important sustainability is, in terms of how you can match your obligations to what your faith is telling you is important? And decide those positions, agree and record them, and use that process of building up your faith consistent investment policy and guidelines to really build up from those values and positions all the way through to what you want to invest in, but also what you will invest in. Make a statement, make a commitment. The next part is the review. It's almost the audit of kind of looking and seeing, when we look at what we have today, when you look at who you work with, what you have, how you invest, and even how some of your grant and philanthropy activities could be extended into investment, just review what proportion of your assets are truly faith consistently invested and what that says in terms of where you could be aspiring to go in the future. Because this is definitely a journey. When, as Matthew says, there has been a lot of progress in terms of improved data. There are more and more organizations who are doing this, in groups who are really sharing what they know and sharing information. And it's important to be aspirational, because it is possible to build the kind of critical mass and momentum that helps consultants and managers and others to really provide the kind of data that we need in order to shift the capital. So review what you have, and together with that, be it aspirational, and identify what the challenges are and where you would most benefit from support. It's important to get the internal buy-in, and then it's important to work out between peers and other organizations where you can get the support in order to deliver a real change in the way in which you invest. And then it's about the advocacy side. It's about publishing those plans, those policies, and exactly linking from the faith values and positions all the way to what you do in a way that communicates not only to your own faith-based group, but also to the laity, the faithful who also look to their organizations for leadership and guidance on how to invest. And also to those consultants, managers, and other service providers who are really also helping us along this journey. I mean, one of the questions that we get is, we appreciate the need for this. This really helps. It helps to set a North Star. But once we've set our North Star, how can faith-based organizations then identify which consultants and managers and others understand us, understand faith-consistent investing, and therefore how can we make it easier to spot the subset of opportunities that can really fit with us? So there is an important advocacy work to be done by faith-based asset owners internally with their laity and with those service providers, so that the whole ecosystem together can work to create more opportunities that really deliver the change that we want to see. And that links very strongly into engagement, engaging with coalitions, organizations, networks, and really seeing how we can build that momentum, share that knowledge, and not be working individually, but working on this in conjunction with others. She'll just give a little sense of where FaithInvest can help and support with some of this work. We are soon to be launching a member platform, which is where some of our working groups and some of our kind of discussions and activities and resources will be shared. It'll be a community space for our members to really kind of build and get into some of these questions in more depth. I mean, we're seeing questions about, can we get some of these statements and guides in more detail? That's exactly the kind of place where we'll review and examine and really try and learn from each other. The member support, the support of the team, myself, Matthew, Mike, the whole of the FaithInvest team, to really try and get to know exactly where organizations are, because we recognize that within each faith-based organization, you cannot generalize what the challenge is or how the solution will sit. And it really is about understanding and then about working in conjunction with the network and with us. And finally, we talk about events to really support this and to move this forward. Events may take the form of a short webinar like this, and we'll also encourage you to look out for a save the date for our first members event, which will be happening in June, where again, we'll be following these topics and others in greater detail. I'll talk about them just now, but it really a case of getting together as communities of people who really want to actually implement the change and shift the capital to make a positive difference. And if you can see some of the current working groups there, faith consistent policies and guidelines is the one we're highlighting. It's the topic today. And to emphasize again, it's about both sides of the story. It's about both creating and auditing those faith consistent guidelines that you have, but then also thinking together, how can we use what we know and what we have to help our providers and suppliers really help us to be more faith consistent. So the whole message of today has been, it's important to invest with your values. It actually makes a difference. It is possible to invest with your values. It is possible to set up a plan and strategy that goes all the way from your beliefs and values to how you invest. And that ultimately, when you shift the capital, you get the outcomes, as Dave was talking about outcomes. When you shift the capital in an aligned manner, you get the outcomes that your faith is promoting. And through the work of policy and guidelines, and through our work and other partners' work of really increasing the visibility of the demand for this support and addressing the supply issues, we really hope that we can support you in the journey to be more faith consistent in your investment. Thank you so much for your attention so far. Just before we get to the questions, just to kind of share a sense that it's been very interesting doing this work, speaking to other different organizations and getting to understand their sense of how it all comes together. And the sense that there doesn't have to be a disconnect between what you believe and how you invest. There doesn't have to be a disconnect between the language of faith and the narrative language of faith and the quantitative language of investments and policies, or slightly more technical language of investments and policies and guides. It is possible to build a bridge between them so that money can genuinely be shifted. And I hope that that's a message that we'll be happy to kind of debate and work with us in building that forward. I will also invite attendees to really share with us what they think is important. And also beyond this webinar, we'd like to encourage you to maybe listen to a previous one that we did that actually set out with a few different groups, how they actually applied faith consistent investing in 3 different contexts: in the context of a Jewish network, in the context of a Buddhist Sikh development finance organization, and in the context of the Quakers, so that we kind of tie together the practice and the theory. So we have a nice, interesting question just to start. Is speculation allowed in bridging values and investment? That is not a question FaithInvest will answer. But what I will say that if you look at different faiths and different traditions, you have various interesting and quite specific views around whether speculation is allowed. We of course know 2 examples that I think are commonly known even among those who aren't of those faiths are the Islamic finance principles, which in general do not allow speculation, and also Buddhist principles, which very much discourage such. It's why we go back to the point of looking deeply into your faith values and positions and really rooting your plans in those values and positions so that you can clearly communicate to those who manage your investments what matters. It is really about being that fundamentally grounded. So there isn't a checklist that says, if you're a faith, this is what you can and can't do. It's your internal organization's belief based on the faith foundations. This is what our faith encourages us to do and discourages us from doing. Next one. Any hint on how to persuade a church maintenance fund's elderly trustees they need, and leave that all to the stockbrokers? Matt, let me give you that one.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I will say on the prior question, documenting that in your investment policy, what do we mean by speculation? What does it include? What doesn't it include? And incorporating that into your investment policy, really important to do. So having that discussion and then documenting it clearly, very important. And I will say to this that it's accepted good practice for any institutionally managed pool of assets to have these governing documents, to have the policy, to have the guidelines, and that in part serves as for the North Star, as the sort of the guiding light for the governance of that plan assets. It's just considered good practice to have those and to keep those documents living. We see also faith investors make those documents public. So certainly they make it public within the faith so that members of that faith can see how are the assets being managed, under what principles are they being managed, under what guidelines are being managed. And you can see examples of where faiths have made those even available to the broad public, being completely transparent about how those assets are being managed. So I think an argument there is just, it is accepted industry practice. It's a good practice. It also provides a very important guidestone to the management of the assets. And then helpfully, if you don't have these documents already, there's already some great examples out there from other faiths who have gone through these steps of documenting their principles and guidelines. And certainly we can help bridge some of those connections as well.
Thank you, Matthew. I will take Beres's couple of questions. They're both really important, kind of raising the bar in terms of complexities of some of these things. So in terms of Beres's question, beyond negative screening and first rung SDG purpose investments, are there examples of faith-inspired investing that address inequality, reaching the hardest to reach high-risk constituencies by factoring in an at-risk portfolio using blended finance? And the answer is, Beres, yes, there are. It is interesting, actually, that when you look at the faith-based organization agenda compared to the broad SDG agenda, I always note the fact how many more are so focused on the social cohesion and prosperity for all aspects of the agenda compared to the environmental emphasis. Now, they all work together, they all interplay together. But when I look at the groups who we talk to, there are quite a few who are asking, what is a fair rate of return? Is any rate of return a fair rate of return when we're trying to address some of these hardest to reach areas? And therefore, can we be the first? And can we actually be the catalyst to get other investors to come in? Now, it's a balance, because the danger is then faith groups are perceived as always being the ones who'll be prepared to put in the below market capital. And we heard from Dave earlier that their affordable housing kind of impact portfolio is at market for a positive return. You have other groups who have both below market and at market. So it is possible to create the structures, but the challenge, I think, is how we scale this kind of opportunity, and maybe how we help the philanthropy and grant-based sections of those same faith-based organizations to maybe be part of the blended finance solution to allow other capital to also come in. It's a long-winded answer. There's a lot to discuss. There's a lot more to be done. And I don't think that we necessarily have the easiest type of blended structures, finance structures in the market yet. I think they often appear too complex for a large number of faith organizations to actually get involved, and some have mandates which limit their ability to even get involved in such structures. But there's an appetite for it, and there's definitely a missionary heart towards going to the places that are hard to reach and being prepared to take a lower return for that purpose. Now, when it comes to prioritization of partnerships with local businesses, I must say that I have seen less of this, and I'd love to kind of discuss with you and with others beyond this conversation where this can go. From our perspective, we do really see a role for entrepreneurship and a role for faith to really drive that and support that and encourage faith groups who are supporting local businesses or local opportunities with grants to see how they can help those businesses to become more sustainable, more entrepreneurial, and thereby build up opportunities that way. But from a perspective so far, it's not something I have seen as much as the screening opportunities. I will pass the next couple back to you, Matthew.
Okay, so this is And I would, on those prior questions, again, important to document those in the principles. So having a focus on local businesses that should tie to a faith value, you should be able to make that connection and then document it in the principles, and then turn it into a guideline that allows you to do those types of investments in the program. Another question here, priority of FaithInvest and advocacy, what types of topics and companies. And one of our roles, Nana, I think here is being an advocate for the faith with the asset management and consultant community. We're certainly working and talking with all of you. We hear a lot, and we hear a lot of what's working with the asset management community and the consulting community and the data provider community. We hear a lot of what's not working with those communities as well. Nan and I have a background in those communities. We have connections and links, and that community looks to the asset manager consulting community, looks to us to be sort of an input or a guide to what faiths are seeking on the investment side of their organization. So that's an important bridge that we are and hope to be more as we engage more of you in this type of work with your plan. We've already gotten some great feedback just examining some of these guidelines, talking with some of you about your policies and guidelines that we can take back to these organizations and say, here's a problem or here's a challenge that the faiths are facing. You can be part of the solution. Yeah, so this goes to the question on bridging, and that's one of the main roles we see ourselves serving, is really, again, helping the faith express their needs with the asset management community, and then helping that asset management community come up with solutions that address those faith's needs. I noticed as I have come into the space with FaithInvest that there's a lot of talking that's going like this, where the faiths are expressing a need or a want or value here, and the asset management community is saying, is this the solution? And they're just not collecting and connecting and bridging those two, connecting those two. Oftentimes it's a matter of having the conversation around a common language, and that's an area where FaithInvest can help, is sort of encouraging that common language among the faith and the asset management investment community, so you can make that connection and meet.
Absolutely. And just to add to what Matthew is saying, it's also obviously that community is very keen on standards and reporting and showing themselves to be aligned. And it's how do we also become part of that conversation so that faith consistency becomes as relevant as any of the other measures and metrics that people look at. So in terms of the question on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, I won't answer for the whole market in general, but what I will say is that in terms of the technology, the blockchain technology that sits underneath these, there are groups who are really pushing to say, if impact is about outcomes and not output, how can we really track what we commit all the way through to the end user, to the final beneficiary, to really see what the impact is? And so if I think about the technology underlying those particular versions of it, I do think that there's massive scope for that technology to really increase the visibility of what is really happening in terms of impact, and take away some of the fear as to whether you're getting greenwashed or any other type of brush on top of what is actually happening. In terms of the currencies themselves, I mean, this is a whole separate debate for a whole different webinar, whether this will encourage a kind of increased liquidity and an increased kind of fluidity in terms of ability to move payments across markets and borders, and therefore open up markets and possibilities that didn't exist. I think the jury is still out on these particular uses of the technology, but I think the technology itself will have an impact in terms of our ability to really track and see what is happening. And then
there are certainly organizations that would argue that Bitcoin is not environmentally friendly. So this is a difficult discussion. It could be the next asset class. Your governing board should be debating this with your consultant. Is this an asset class? Does it align with our values and help achieve some of those things? And should we include in our portfolio? And this type of process encourages that type of discussion and documentation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matthew. And then just the question, can we share the Methodist guidelines? Yes, they are publicly available. And as you can see, you can hear Dave is a strong advocate of actually encouraging groups to work through the process, to hold themselves accountable, and to encourage others to really deliver long-term sustainable returns by aligning the way they invest with the values that they believe in as far as possible, as is possible, and to work together to extend the market options so that eventually it will be possible to be 100% faith aligned. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attention and for your questions, and please feel free to keep asking. We're keen to get to know anyone who is interested to hear more. You can contact us at engagement@faithinvest.org. And we just leave you in the safe hands of our CEO, Martin Palmer, to finish off our event for today. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Nana, and thank you, Matt, and of course our chair, Dave Zellner. Delighted to have you all here. One of the things that I've learned, which I did not expect to learn, as we set up FaithInvest over 3 years ago now, was how very little resources you actually have as fund managers to run your funds. This was a complete revelation to me, and hence, of course, the reason why so much of this is outhoused to outside agencies. And in a sense, I hope you will see FaithInvest as being an additional member of staff, somebody here to help you, particularly on due diligence, particularly on making the links, on finding projects and helping you to evaluate them without putting an extra burden on you. In fact, if anything, taking something that burden off you. But there was a very interesting question earlier about how do we deal with elderly trustees of our board who have always done it this way and basically are going, well, what's the problem? Well, I think the problem is the contemporary world that we live in, and the fact that we have not, as faiths, frankly, lived up to our own teachings and values. But I hope that together we can do this. I certainly sense in just the 4 or 5 years that I've been working on this side, although I've been involved with faith and investments since 2001, I really do sense a change in the climate, a change in the way we're thinking. It's enormously exciting. It's a great privilege to be involved, but we can only do this with you, and we hope that we will be able to help you do it very well. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for a wonderful range of questions. Nana's fear that there was going to be none at the beginning was somewhat more than answered. So thank you so much. Take care. And we look forward to seeing you at future events and to hearing from you and to having you as part of the family. Thank you.